And then I start realizing that I'm having other strange experiences. I make friends with a little girl that I play with at night at the bottom of our street. Turns out she's really an old lady. And that I'll leave for you to read in the book. I'm still on bliss, absolute bliss. I get there and I see a Christ-like figure. Now, I'm reluctant to call it Christ. So anyway, I'm on my death journey. I see the Christ figure. I go down closer to the water. I just wanted, he put his arms out to me. It was the most welcoming thing ever in my whole life. Part of the universe. You are part of everything. You are part of some greater power.
All right, folks, we're here today with Lynne McGee, and she is our guest for today, and she has quite a fascinating story. She has been psychic and had supernatural experiences since she was a kid, and then later, and she went through a lot of interesting things. And so we're going to try to cover a lot of ground here, but she had an NDE experience in her adult life, and she's written a book called Anything's Possible. And I'm reading the book right now, and let me tell you, it's quite fascinating. And so welcome, Lynne. It's a pleasure to have you on. And how's things in Australia right now?
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, it's nice in Australia where I am. Anyway, it's cold down south still, but it's starting to warm up for summer here. It's one of the first warmer days we've had for a long time. We didn't really do winter, though, I have to admit. So you can't really call 15 degrees winter, can you? 15 Celsius, that is.
Yeah, especially not where I'm from. And we're actually just getting over summer and heading into the fall. So I'm in Idaho, the state of Idaho in the US, which is in the Pacific Northwest. So that's quite interesting. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of a bio, and then let's get right into your NDE, or perhaps a little bit leading up to it, wherever you feel like starting.
Okay. Well, I was born in the UK, so I'm Welsh born, and some people say that I have like Celtic intuition because I was born aware of being born, aware of not wanting to be born. I had thought processes that obviously can't be proven, but they're very clear to me to this day. And I thought, because you don't know any different, that everybody went through the same thing, because kids don't know that they're different. They just exist. You know, they're totally ego-centered. So, yeah, I was born protesting all the way, did not want to come into my mum, was above her, saw her below me, and then made the last minute decision. For what reason, I don't know, other than a fear of failure. I can't imagine why I came. Next minute I'm born, and I had an unusual birth in that my mother's first words to me were not pleasant. I was covered in hair. I was a very late baby and I was covered in very long hair. And basically, she told me how ugly I was. There were other words, but I won't repeat them. It wasn't about love. This is what I didn't understand as a baby, was that the way she spoke to me had an effect on me. That wasn't her fault at the time. My mother's a blunt, down-to-earth person, heart of gold, not the best communication skills from a loving point of view. Anyway, I didn't stop remembering things like babies are supposed to. So about 3 days old, I remember meeting my grandmother. All of this is confirmed, and I've written about that in detail in the book. So wind forward a few years and you've got a little girl who's already had spiritual experiences, already had spiritual visitors, lived through quite severe grief at 6 months of age because I'd bonded with my dad instead of my mum for reasons that probably obvious based on what I've said. And I bonded with dad. Dad was in the Merchant Navy and he went off to sea for a few months. And so I lost that bond and was in grief. And basically when he returned, I I was being cuddled by him. It was the middle of the night. He was dying to see me and my brother. Mum got us both up. I got cuddled by Dad. And in my sleepiness, she decided it was time to put me back to bed after some period of time. And I was separated from my father again. And I had what I can only describe as a breakdown. And that is my first, at 6 months of age, my first clear memory of seeing figures. Again, I was just a child. I thought they were normal. It turns out they were spiritual beings. And some people, if I'd explained that to my mother when I was 5 or 6, she would have said I was making it up, but it was very real. The lady who approached me and soothed me stayed with me for many years, all of my growing up years. So that was the start of my life. Wind forward till I'm about 6, maybe. I'm not very good at remembering ages, so about 6, and I'm now having other spiritual experiences that I think are perfectly normal. So at night, someone comes to my room and they take me out of my body. We go up and we sit on the roof and we watch the neighborhood close down for the night, and I watch the lady across the road who I adored. She was a very close friend of my mother's. I watched her washing her dishes, closing her curtains for the night, all that normal sort of neighborhood settling. And I learned things from this person who sits with me. I never remember what I learned. I just know that I asked questions and I got told things. So I'm turning into a very different child. Now, around the age of 7, logic starts creeping in and you start questioning these things and you start questioning visitors. And it's perfectly normal at that time for young children to no longer have childhood invisible friends. They disappear. They're still there, but the child stops interacting with them because their logical mind says they can't be, and their parents say they can't be. And all of us kids are a bunch of suckers and we fall for what the adults tell us. And logic at that point, but from 7 to 9, logic takes over and it rules most of us for the rest of their lives. In my case, that was a major fail. The reason it was a major fail was my parents were overly strict. I wasn't bonded with my mother. I needed an outlet. I needed a survival tool for coping with a strict parent and a father who was barely ever around. Now, he was no longer in the Merchant Navy. He became a policeman at this time in my life. So, yes, I saw more of him, but emotionally, he was barely engaged. He was just constantly tired, working. Christmases and birthdays were about the only time I remember playing with my father, unless we went to the park, which was a big deal, or had a family day. So that was basically my life. And I'm living with spiritual visitors coming in and telling me things. Whenever I got upset, Mum punished me, or in those days they used to send you to bed with no dinner. That was quite common in my neighbourhood. So I'd get sent to bed with no dinner, feeling very sorry for myself, never ever accepting that the punishment fitted the crime. And today that would horrify people anyway, and they'd say it doesn't. But, you know, maybe it did. I don't know. My mother didn't have many tools to punish with. So
Now, can I ask you a question? Are you of the mindset that we plan our lives ahead of time, or we agree kind of to a contract or a soul contract? Maybe not every detail, but we have like mile markers. Are you of that mindset at all?
absolutely. I believe that we are offered lives to choose from. We accept a life. I had accepted a life, and I think the memories that I have of not wanting to be born is because I did not want to accept that contract at the last minute. It held too much responsibility and, to be honest, too much pain. There's a lot of suffering as you read through my book, and you'll see that there's a lot of suffering in there. There's an awful lot that isn't in the book. So remember that as you go through. So there's a lot of suffering, and I think I tried to back out for that very reason. But we have got, and I had the strong idea when I was waiting to be born and trying to delay it, I had the strong idea that I had overcommitted and I didn't want to do it. So yes, there's a contract.
I sort of imagine us all going, oh yeah, I can do that, piece of cake. Yeah. And then we get here and we're like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? You know.
Yeah, kind of like that. But the thing is, what you're asked to do is always going to pressure you. It's always going to push you. And I learned that in my NDE. You don't get off with, oh, I can have a good life, or I can have a bad life, or I can have a challenging life. You get 4 or 5 lives, and every single one is going to give you the same lesson. The punishment or the challenge may come in a completely different form, but the pain is going to be the same. The challenge that you have to get through and learn is going to be rock solid the same on how it affects you. So, yeah, I didn't want to come. It was too much. And as you read through the book, you probably see why. Anyone who reads it will understand. But yeah, could have been a lot worse. I always say that. Could have been a lot worse. I could think of 100 scenarios that would have had me backpedaling even harder. But anyway, I came.
I highly recommend the book, and folks, and I'll link to it in the description in the video too.
Thank you. That's lovely. Yeah, so around the age of 7, I got type 1 diabetes. So I immediately became different to my friends. I was singled out in class. I was watched carefully. Wherever I was, people were protective of me. Everybody watched my food intake. If I looked tired, people got worried that I had low sugar. Now, these days, type 1 diabetes is a big deal still. In those days, it was still considered a death sentence.
Yeah.
I received a book that said I would probably lose at least one limb if I lived to be a teenager. And if I made it into my 20s, I was very likely going to be blind. And this was part of my childhood education as a 7-year-old. So pretty scary stuff.
Definitely.
Anyway, so around the age of 7, I've now got a big difference to other kids anyway. My logical brain's starting to kick in, and I start saying things to my friends. Like when we're playing, I will randomly say, oh, you know, the people who come and talk to you in the nighttime when you're in bed. And heads would swivel and go, what on earth are you talking about? No, we don't have people. So I learned to zip it very fast. You know, you immediately knew. Everybody looked at you strange. So,
I can only imagine.
But that shows the innocence of childhood, doesn't it? It had not entered my head that anything about my life was unusual.
Yeah,
I was getting into trouble. Yeah,
absolutely.
I would know what in the Christmas cupboard, for instance, for my Christmas presents. And so being only a little kid, every now and again, it would be like, oh, when I get that skipping rope for Christmas, or when my brother gets his new car, and all hell would descend because my mother could only assume that I was sly and sneaking into the cupboard where I shouldn't be in her room and committing all sorts of lying, thieving crimes that little girl shouldn't be involved in. So I got a lot of punishments for things I didn't actually do wrong. I think perhaps the biggest one was she sat by the fireside for months before one Christmas, and she knitted and knitted and knitted all of these dolls' clothes, which she said were for the child across the road, a lovely little girl that I was friends with, and that she was doing them because her mum couldn't. And I'm like, okay, that's lovely. She's going to love those. And I knew from the very first one she started knitting that they were going to be my Christmas present. I still believed in Santa. So this was my aha moment. There is no Santa. If they turn up in my stocking, Santa's dead. You know, it was that kind of. So that speeded my growing up a little bit. And of course, they did turn up in my stocking. So instead of loving them, I just sat there quietly and cried, like, Christmas is ruined.
Yeah.
with them, and I did love them, and my mother never knew, so all good there. But yeah, that was my awake moment. But you know, between things like that and talking to friends and finding out that I was different, I learned to shut up. I learned to retreat into myself and keep these things to myself. Fortunately, I didn't lose them. I think it was a survival tool for me to cope with the very strict parenting. Policeman dad, super strict mum. You weren't allowed to put a toe out of line. Someone was always watching you. You were the policeman's daughter. Everybody knew who you were. You know, it was that kind of an upbringing. So you had to be very careful.
Your dad was a policeman?
By then, he'd become a police officer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
wow.
he was in the British.
So now you were getting it from both sides, from mom and dad.
And and in those days in the UK, to be a police officer was a really big deal. You were looked up to in the neighbourhood. You know, you had stature. And my dad was 6'3", so he didn't need stature. Trust me, wherever he went, people looked at him anyway. So he was tall and nice.
I bet.
So,
did they call him? Did you call him bobbies in there, or is that just a movie thing from the U.S.?
Oh, they were bobbies with the rounded top police hats. They're the old-fashioned hats.
So your dad was a bobby. Okay, I got it.
And we just thought that was normal. So yeah. So I'd started to come out of it. And when I was 7, I had my last birthday party. And it was my last birthday party because my mother realized that you couldn't really at that point, or she couldn't, it was beyond her, to hold a birthday party for a diabetic and give me all the party food. It just wasn't possible. Yeah. In these days where you can adjust insulin all the time, it's a lot easier. Children can have more treats. But in those days, everything was very rigid. And I got 1 injection a day to play with. So I had to get it right, you know. So, so after the first party where she couldn't give me things and reacted quite harshly towards me, which is in the book, they just stopped. That was the end of birthday parties for me, which was fine. But the next day, I'm looking at all the birthday cards, because in those days, they'd give you the birthday cards from your party so that you could draw on them and use the paper for craft and things like that, because everything was in short supply still.
Yeah.
And so she gave me them, and I'm looking up this one birthday card. And as I looked at it, the girl looked like a young teenager dancing to a little portable record player. And as I looked at it, I realized, and it was like something went through me from head to toe. Everything vibrated in my whole body. And the message that I got was, I will never be a teenager. I am not going to grow up. I won't be that old.
Wow.
And that was my first death warning, because it was real. It was a psychic premonition of something that was in my future. Now, I cried. I was a little child. I cried. I didn't want to die. It was beyond me dealing with this. So I cried myself to sleep that night. In my sleep, I was woken again by what I now call my guide. I did not have words for her then, but the lady who had originally come to me at 6 months old came to me again, soothed me. She was the gentle mother. It was like I had a wide awake, strict mum who could be very cold, and this loving, adoring, gentle mother who made me feel better. So I was still supported through that.
So do you consider her your guide?
Yes, I have no way of describing her. I'm still very, very torn about what to call or label things, but you have to have labels, don't you? Otherwise, none of it can make sense to anyone else, let alone to you. I can accept that a woman came and comforted me, but how do I tell you a woman came into my room without my parents' permission inside a locked house?
Yeah.
And make sense of it if I
especially back in the day. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But I emphasize I did not have a name for her then. I had a Christian name. I called her Sarah. very strange. It was like Sarah with an accent. When you think I was a little Welsh girl, so my accent was like that, and that's how I talked to my mum and dad all the time. I was Welsh. Welsh was how it was. Sarah was not a name in Welsh. So it's very strange that I got that name for her anyway. I hadn't heard it anywhere. It was special just for her.
Did you get it from her, you think, or maybe it was an
I
impression from
think
her?
so. Yes, I think so. But as you read through the book, the story tells how I actually knew her and where she came from. And there is a tie in there to past life. I
Yeah.
don't have life memories, but there is a tie in there to past life, which appears clearly only when I'm an adult with children of my own. So
Wow, you don't have any past life memories after all you've been through? I guess maybe
I got
you've
enough to deal with.
yeah, you had enough to deal with. It's like, no, we're not doing that on this life, or maybe the next one or something.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of vague things, but I don't really bring them in other than this particular story that involves Sarah, because everything that is vague to me has been left out of the book. If I can't speak it with confidence, I won't share it. I need to be able to stand my ground and say, this is my reality. This is what happened to me. So, for instance, there was a doctor who delivered me in the delivery room. I don't mention the doctor because I have a very strong feeling of ice coldness, which is when I'm still up there above my mum. I have a vague memory of something white coming through a door and a gruff voice, and a very grave, very, very, very dim memory of the white coat leaning over my mother and then storming out of the room. Now, I discussed that with my mum, and she said that is exactly what happened with the doctor. He came in last minute, delivered the baby, left it to the nurses, and ran. I only present things in my book that are very clear memories. If anything is vague, I haven't brought it in. So like there is no doctor in the delivery room, but there was a doctor who breezed in and breezed out, as confirmed by my mother. But I couldn't tell you a thing about that doctor other than a white coat. So I left my memory of that out completely. Anyway, so I had this lady who comes to me. Had this impression of a message of going to die. I've started telling friends things and finding out that I'm different and that they don't have the same experiences. So I'm starting to be ostracized. Apparently you only have to say one or two odd things. I'm going through all this phase and I'm starting to be ostracized because you do only need to say one or two weird, strange things to your childhood friends for them to start shunning you as well. There was a slight age group between the children I mixed with in my street. I was actually the older of the small group I mixed with. There was an older group again, but they were more my brother's friends. So my personal friends were slightly younger, and so they thought I was a bit strange. Now, I might say that based on the fact they thought I was strange, they obviously weren't having similar experiences to me. So they probably had normal births and normal childhoods, and they didn't have any of these experiences and memories to live with. So I get to 7 and I start getting logical, and my life starts to change because now I'm aware that I'm slightly different. I'm not sure how different. I'm not really sure why I'm different. I have no one to talk to about this, no access to anything at all, because this is in the 60s. Early 60s. And so I have nowhere to turn except back to the people in my head. And then I start realizing that I'm having other strange experiences. I make friends with a little girl that I play with at night at the bottom of our street. Turns out she's really an old lady. And that I'll leave for you to read in the book, because if you haven't read it, you will have, because I know what you're up to, but for those, I don't want to spoil it for everyone.
Yeah, I read a
But
little
you
bit
learn
about
about
that. Yeah.
so you learn about death. And so now you're really growing up. You know, I'm turning 8. I'm turning 9. And now, because I come from a fairly logical science background as far as my family is concerned, my older brother was completely involved in science. He had no room in his life for anything else. I'm trying to look at these from a logical thing. So, okay, I have different abilities. What can I do with them? What are they good for? Um, I start doing things like sitting in class thinking about models that I have on my dressing table and moving the models with my mind. No idea if it will work, but hey, I've done it once at night and thought maybe I imagined it. So when I'm bored in class, I try doing it for real and it works. How do I know it works? Because first thing when I come through the door that afternoon, I'm in trouble from my mother for not having all my models in place on my dresser when she goes into dust that day. And I mean, she was that strict. You could not have a thing out of place in your room. Everything had to be perfect. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm getting into trouble. Meanwhile, inside, I'm jumping up and down with excitement. You know, this actually worked. I did this. No idea how, but I know it works. Uri Geller was then on television probably about a month after that.
Oh,
And
wow.
I spent 4 trying to bend spoons with my mind and completely failing. So it had to be things that moved, that were light. I couldn't do heavy metal stuff. I've tried as an adult, I still fail. So there are limits. I'm sure
Not,
that if I went to a class, got shown how to do it properly, it's possible. I totally believe it's possible. I have seen someone do it randomly who thought it was normal because no one had ever told them it wasn't. And I thought that was beautiful. But this was many years ago now. They just picked up a spoon and rubbed it, and I watched the spoon bend, and I'm like, I want to do that. It was a man from Latvia, and he
yeah.
thought it was a great yeah, he thought it was a great party trick. So it's possible. I personally have never achieved it. I think we all have individual abilities. And then I get another warning that I'm going to die. I have a baby brother, totally besotted with him, completely besotted, because I've been told by my guides that I'm going to get this baby brother. I've moved countries because I'm told by my guides we will be emigrating. Everything they told me always happened. So I've got no reason to doubt them. Everything my parents told me didn't always happen because parents fob you off. So who did I trust more? I trusted what we call our guides today. They never let me down. They never failed me. I saw various levels of guides, which is interesting, which made me believe that if guides do really exist and it's not a form of external projection of the mind of what we know is part of our written record for our future lives. So we probably held this information. As a child, it would be very easy to project that onto somebody who comes and tells you it, because children have very creative imaginations. I can't say yes or no that happens, but I leave that open as a possibility that the creative mind can create visuals of something it needs in its life.
I happen to think that we are creators, and imagination is more than just a kid's thing, that it's actually the part of the process of creation, and we are the creators of our reality to a large degree, so to speak. That's my opinion anyways.
Yeah, I think that's a whole other discussion, isn't it?
We tend to discount, imagination. Oh, that's what kids do, that's not for adults, right? But I think there's more to it than that anyways, at least.
To it, I agree with you. Yeah. Anyway, I then began to get warnings. Originally, I was going to die at 15. I was told I would die at 15. As I got closer to 15, I pretty much, when I wasn't at school, I went everywhere with my little brother. He brought a lot of joy and a lot of love into my life. And my parents didn't have family because we'd emigrated, so they didn't have family. They didn't have babysitters. So I was 12 years older than him, so I became the built-in babysitter, which I was delighted to be. So I'm still basically a child operating from a self-survival need. Very much a loner, very much introverted, and trying to be what my parents wanted me to be. I would say my father was an introvert, to be honest, so it's an inherited capacity that I have. But still, my mum was an extrovert. My older brother was very shy, but having said that, he became quite extroverted. Well, I would say very extroverted as he became a teenager. He just had that very shy side. So I was trying to be like the rest of them because I knew I wasn't. And, you know, you don't like to be. So I tried. Anyway, about a month before I turned 15, maybe only 2 weeks, I went to sleep. Before I went to sleep, I had suddenly remembered that I was supposed to die at 15 because, yes, you can forget these things if you need to in childhood. So I hadn't completely forgotten, but I pushed it right to the back of my mind. And all of a sudden, it became very real. I was about to reach that age. Would I die? So I started questioning, remembering that I'm now 15, pure logic, working like the rest of my family, not really even using intuition very much at all. Being a teenager, quite often overriding what was intuition and, you know, continuing to get into trouble because of it. And I go to sleep wondering whether this is true and whether I need to be afraid. Part of me was a little bit nervous. Part of me was like, do I even believe it now? I went to sleep, and that night I got told that I would not die at 15 because of my love of my brother. They didn't want to affect him. And as my reward, I was going to be allowed 3 more years of life. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm a teenager. First thing, I woke up very relieved, super, super relieved. And then I was like, well, if it didn't happen then, it's all in my head. It's not going to happen. So I put it completely out of my head, didn't worry about it. I was going to be fine. That's all that mattered. I was making this stuff up. And then at 18, I had a near-death experience, didn't I? On my 18th birthday. They were right. And it was an unavoidable illness. It was something where your immune system turns on itself. And so I had a severe bout of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which results in blisters all over the body. However, I was living in a country town, and they didn't have, the doctors that were there taking care of me didn't have enough knowledge to diagnose me accurately. And when these blisters became massive and became grapefruit size in some cases, from head to toe, covered my eyes. So from tiny blisters that started looking like chicken pox, through to fruit size blisters, to be gross, filled with pus. Obviously that wasn't Stevens-Johnson's, because Stevens-Johnson's does get pussy, but not to that extent. The blisters don't get that big. So I was probably in severe septicemia by then. And my parents were told that I wouldn't live. And so they refused to take that for an answer and demanded that I be flown to a city hospital where I would get more appropriate care. And the lack of care is written in the book. Now, when I talk about lack of care, I cannot include the 2 young doctors from the UK who were on exchange in this country town, who stayed up night and day for 2 weeks trying to save my life. They did everything any doctor could possibly have done for me. And obviously they succeeded. So they gave me a chance, didn't they? If it wasn't for them. So anyway, my parents ended up paying to fly me by commercial jet. My parents were not at all well off. They remortgaged their house. which already had
Mm.
one mortgage. So they took out a huge loan to make sure, as my mother said, if my daughter's going to die, she's not going to die here in this hellhole that you're keeping her in. The details of that in the book, so we won't go into them here. Yeah. And I was going on the plane the next morning. I was told only just before she left, and she eventually left and said she had to go because she had to pack her suitcase to go. Obviously, she didn't trust my dad to do that. Fair enough. But she left me. It was the only time I'd never wanted to be left alone. And I knew that she shouldn't be leaving me. I honestly cannot say that I had accepted that I was about to die, but I can say from an animal perspective, I knew I was going to die. And that's why I didn't want her to go. I wanted her to stay till the end. And then that night I came out of my body and I looked down at this poor broken girl on the bed and was absolutely horrified by what I saw. I was barely recognizable as myself.
How old were you? 18?
18. Happy 18th birthday.
Oh boy.
Some people go to celebrate. Yeah. So yeah, that's how I spent my 18 in hospital with a very, very high fever of 47.3 degrees. So I should not have been alive. And I know it was 47 because I can still remember a moment of clarity because I was going in and out of consciousness and my eyes could see, and then a blister would burst. I wouldn't be able to see, then I would be able to see a little bit. And what happened was when the nurse took my temperature initially, she didn't believe it. So she showed it to my mum and got my mum to read it. And my mum was horrified. The nurse was horrified. And she said, it can't be right. I'll get another thermometer. And they ended up with, I don't know how many, but several nurses piled into this tiny space beside my bed. I remember them just out of the corner of my eye and trying to turn my head to look at them and get a better view because they were all exclaiming. They had a small jar of the old-fashioned thermometers, and they had put them all over my body, taking my temperature because they couldn't believe that my temperature could be so high. So anyway, there I am up on the ceiling, looking down at my body, feeling sorry for this girl. No concept of what I was. Like up there on the ceiling, looking down, it's the most freeing thing you can possibly imagine because you've left your body, therefore you have no weight. The body's lying there on the bed and you're observing it. I'm observing the room. I won't go into too much detail there because it's all in the book, but I'm observing the room. I'm disgusted. I'm horrified. And the next minute, I feel the presence that is me moving and I'm suddenly on a train. There's a lot of argument about whether this is a stage of brain death. And if this is a stage of brain death, that makes sense to me right there in that you're fully aware as if you're standing with the body when you're up in the corner of the room. Once you go on the train, you're just a mind. Nothing else. Nothing else. So I went on the train journey through the tunnel towards the light and all of the details that you read in multiple NDEs. And I'm on this journey and the next minute I'm not on the train. I've gone towards the light, and when I hit the light, I'm suddenly back in what I think is a hospital, on a hospital bed, being pushed by two nurses to theatre. I know I'm going to theatre. The doors are way down a corridor in front of me. I can see them over the top of my feet. Now, this is interesting because from the time I lifted from my body, I had no pain and I had perfect vision, something that I'd not had for days. So I'd been in severe pain, and while I was in my body, I could barely see anything. And a lot of the time I couldn't see anything because of the blisters covering the surface of my eyes. Now I had clear sight, clear feeling, everything was lucid. So they're pushing me. The closer they get to the doors, the more I'm unhappy. I don't want to have an operation. What am I having an operation for? This to me would be the brain death part, where you're like aware that something's going wrong, but you don't know what it is. So you're still thinking as if you're in a body, but you're not able to make sense of it. So that could, to me, easily be brain death, a part of brain death. Anyway, I struggle, and I realize as part of my awareness that the nurses aren't talking. They're not giving me reassurance. They're not talking to each other. Now, I've been through many operations in my life and in many situations, having type 1 diabetes from childhood, where I've been on trolleys with nurses and they always talk. It's part of the reassure the patient thing, or chattering amongst themselves, but they always talk. And this is completely silent. So I twist my head and I look back and I see that my nurses aren't nurses at all. They are faceless figures in these long robes, grayish robes. And I'm terrified, absolutely terrified. And as I turn back, we enter the theatre doors, and life is not real from then on. I am suddenly in the most perfect space I have ever been in, ever. I am completely loved, completely absorbed by the light, by the energy. There are misty figures in this light, still with robes. I am somehow having my bed put to one side. They're caring for me. I know I go in and out of some form of awareness. I don't know how long for. There are other people there in this room. They're also being cared for, but not by the robed figures that care for me.
These
And
robed
then,
figures, they
yeah.
almost sound alien-like a little bit, the way you described them. Were you thinking that at all, or?
At the time, no. Once you go through the doors, I think when I realized they had no faces when I'm outside the doors, absolute terror. I mean, my brother used to watch Doctor Who, and that was as close as I could come to aliens. And I did not like the show because most of the time when I did watch it, it scared the heck out of me. So
Okay.
tried not to watch. If I was in the same room, I would spend my whole time looking down. I'd read a book. I would do anything but not watch, because crawlies and all sorts, and it was not my little girl mind type of thing. So yes, outside the door, it was like aliens. Inside the door, no fear of them whatsoever. Absolutely none. So I can totally understand why someone would call them aliens, because we don't have names for anything that doesn't fit human existence. So they're alien to us. Whether they're aliens in the sense of little green men, that's another thing entirely. To me, now I would just say they were spirits with specific jobs. And that takes me down another track if I branch out, that I believe that work continues on different levels, and if there is another existence, we continue working for the health and well-being of other spirits on different levels for eternity. Possibly that's too much of a possibility.
Yeah, I think there's so much more than we know and understand. Even if we've had some experiences like this is just a glimpse, so to speak, of certain things. There's much more out there than we know.
Yeah, we're just one little midget in a massive universe of universes, of more universes. So it would be pretty arrogant to think we knew it all, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then I'm deemed well enough to now leave this lovely, beautiful room. A part of me didn't want to go, I'll be quite honest, because it was just the nicest I'd ever felt. I'd like to say in my life, but I'm not sure if I was alive or not. So I really don't know how to describe that. But in using our terminology, it was the best I had ever felt in my whole life. I did not want that phase to end. There were no worries, no cares, no stress, no pressure, nothing at all but love. I was then escorted by another being through the door, Didn't even know there was a door till that moment. But I'm escorted through a door, and suddenly I'm left on my own, walking through beautiful green hills, beautiful gardens, children playing in the distance, the sounds of homes. You could see houses, you could see people in them, but everything was love. Above all, everything was love. And again, they say that's depriving the brain of oxygen. Okay, so technically I figure by now I should be half brain dead, surely, if it is depriving the brain of oxygen.
You know, I've really actually researched that quite a bit, and that's actually just a theory. They have no evidence to really support that. And there's I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Eben Alexander had a near-death experience, and he was a neurosurgeon who didn't believe in any of this kind of stuff until he had that experience. And he explained it one time, and I read that and I go, oh, that makes perfect sense. And he says, and the medical community absolutely has no evidence. That's just a theory. And so I kind of go with that until I get more information.
The reason I say it is because you're going to have viewers looking at this just to refute it. And I think it's really important for them to know that those of us who have been through it are well aware that it can be refuted. But if this is me and my brain is dying, why did I come back with the same brain competency as I had before? So this is part of my point that I'm actually making. Okay, so It doesn't make sense. To me, it's still a theory. You have to leave it open to a theory until it's proven it's not proof. So then I go through all the beautiful green grass and all of this sort of stuff, and I'm walking, and the sun is comfortable, everything's comfortable, absolute bliss. But I feel that I'm going somewhere, that I know where I'm going, and that I'm being drawn there. And I end up walking through what I would call a tropical paradise. Every plant is larger than it is in life. Some of them don't really look like plants that I've seen before, but they're all glossy and shiny. The area is beautiful, but the sense of being drawn gets stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And I keep going, and I come over a hill following this cord that's pulling me from my heart center. And I look down, and there is a figure on a small island surrounded by water, way off in the distance. And that's where I'm being drawn to. And so I go there, takes a while. I'm still on bliss, absolute bliss. I get there and I see a Christ-like figure. Now, I'm reluctant to call it Christ. I believe that my early childhood involved me going off to church with anybody who would take me to any church possible. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I also learned to be a cynic by going to everybody else's churches and hearing them condemn church.
Yeah.
So I love churches. I don't necessarily like what's being taught. So I'd already figured that out as a child, that, okay, I have some connection with something bigger than me, but I don't need the teaching to have that connection. It's not necessary. And I've maintained that ever since. You are part of the universe. You are part of everything. You are part of some greater power. Why limit it to a single being?
That was one of the questions I was going to ask you at some point. What was your spiritual or religious background? And I think you went ahead and answered that question. So
my mum used to help out at Sunday school. She wanted us to go to Sunday school. My dad was agnostic. He didn't care what we did so long as he didn't have to go along. And mum was fine with that. Mum stopped going to church before she ever had children. I don't remember her coming with us more than about twice when we were very little, and she wanted us to go. She felt we should. And that's what started my journey. If any of the kids had something on, like there was a kids session at a Baptist church, I'd go. If there was a kids session at an Anglican church, I'd go. If somebody said, would Lynn like to come to church with us on Sunday, and they were Catholic, I went. I learned a lot. Learned a lot about people, and I learned about the bias and prejudices of the priests and pastors at the front of the church. I watched one day one reverend give out jelly tots after the class and only give them to the children who attended regularly and not to those who just breezed in. And I literally walked away thinking, he's never going to convert anyone, is he? So, I mean, I was a young cynic. Yeah. So anyway, I'm on my death journey. I see the Christ figure. I go down closer to the water. I just wanted, he put his arms out to me. It was the most welcoming thing ever in my whole life. And I just wanted to go home. And those were the words that I thought. This is home. This is what I felt to my core. If I go to him, I'll be home. The minute I went to put my toes in the water, I realized, I don't know why and I don't know how, but I realized if I crossed that water, I could never go back, ever. That was it. And a picture of my younger brother appeared in my head, and I couldn't leave him. I didn't want to walk away from that. And so I'm torn, I'm upset, and I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And bang, all of a sudden I'm surrounded by more of these hooded figures. And to my amazement, it's, what are we now? The 70s. So it's 1976 when I'm having this. They not only surround me, it's now all dark. There's barely any light in wherever I am, and they take me to a screen. So I'm going to describe it as if it's a darkened movie theatre. And at the front of this theatre, there are very tall stands, which are basically today's computer stands. If you had a stand in front of an auditorium, specially set up to plug your computer into, it would be that. Except it's 1970s and it's this beautiful, modern, smooth plastic. They had never produced anything like it. And on the top is a laptop like I'm using to speak to you today, but they didn't exist. And they'd never been on Doctor Who. So I know I'd never seen them on Doctor Who. This was a brand new thing. They just didn't exist.
Yeah, back in those days, yeah, computers were mainframe. I used to be a computer technician for about 25 years. And so there was not even graphic interfaces when I first got into it. We did have desktops, the first desktops, but yeah, back in those days, and that wasn't until the late 80s. So back in 1976, yeah, computers were just big, huge mainframes that filled up whole buildings and stuff.
I worked for a mining company a year later, and they had a whole building for their computer, and no one was allowed near it. It was billions of dollars worth, and it took up a whole building. So, and really, it was where they were still using the punch cards. I can't remember what they're called, the punch cards to program everything. So they had the little word processor type things that they put. That's not what they were called, but you know what I mean. So it's probably the generation you were working on your desktop. Yeah, so it was really, really basic, but it at that point, never had anything to do with a computer. Definitely didn't think anything small existed. It didn't. I did later research it, but it didn't exist. It was I think about another 15 years before I saw anything that even vaguely resembled it coming out on the market. And it was so many years before home computers. They had a long way to go. So I'm looking at this screen. They're making me look at this screen, and they proceeded to try and convince me to return to my life by showing me what my future was. I don't want to spoil the story here, but basically, you know, so they showed me what would happen. They showed me now I'm a very isolated person. Yes, I had friends, but inside I was very lonely. I was an introvert. I put on an act to mix with my classmates all the time. And then I went home and I hid from the world. And so my mother used to complain that I didn't go out enough. I didn't. She's right. It wasn't healthy. I read lots of books. I was a geek, really. So they show me what's going to happen. And I'm really, really lonely and really looking for the love I've never had from my mother. To be clear, my mother loved me, but she didn't love me the way I needed to be loved. I needed the warmth. My mother couldn't give me that. She wasn't that type of person. And so they show me having a happy family life in my future. I mean, that really, I've never been a particularly career-minded person. I love learning. I should have had amazing careers, probably 4 branches at the same time. And I haven't, because I'm not money-oriented. I'm not career-oriented. I'm very much family and home-oriented. And that to me was the ultimate dream. I assumed I would leave home and go to university. University was my ticket out of town, I might add, away from my family. So to me, it was a life goal: get to university, get educated, get away. So not that I wanted to leave all my family, I didn't. I just needed to live away from them. And so I wanted to go to university. I was going to achieve that dream. I was going to get a good job. I was going to have the family of my dreams. And then they brought it all crashing down. Now, this is where I say spirit is fallible. People think spirit is all-knowing and they get everything right. They failed. I lost the plot and started screaming and sobbing and like, you are so cruel. How could you take that off me? How could you do that to me? How could you show me all my dream and then take it away? And I'm calmed down. They do calm me down. They do try to explain, but I'm still too upset. And so all of a sudden they're showing me, I don't remember some little bits that happened in there because of my distress. And then they're showing me, if I die, this is what's going to happen. If I choose to die now, I can. I have permission. There's no judgment. And I think that's important for people to know. There is absolutely no judgment. Early on in the piece, I had judged myself for every little thing I'd ever done wrong, which I haven't mentioned, but that's in there. There's no absolutely eternal blame or judgment. You are your own judge and juror when you pass over. So they're showing me that I'm accepted back, but I'm going to have to return when I've recovered from this lifetime. And I'm like, okay. And as part of that, they show me 2 main things. They show me my brother at my graveside. Now, not exactly. They show my parents at my graveside, and they show them returning home and my little brother asking when I'm going to come home, because he's only 4, 6. How old am I? 18. He's 12 years. Yeah, so 6. And he's asking when I'm coming home. And I lost it. I'm like, I've got to go back. I can't do this to him. I just cannot. And so I agreed to go back.
That's just like, okay, yeah, you can stay if you want, but you're just going to have to do it again. So
Have to do again. So before they show me my little brother, I think that must have been the last ditch attempt to get me to go back. They show me the lives that I'm going to have to choose from in the future. So the next 4, I can't remember if there was 4 or 5, because they were very similar and they had the same sort of suffering, but what I perceived as a lot worse. So there was sexual abuse in one, there was an alcoholic parent in another. So still that emotional isolation issue that I'd been dealing with. But on the surface, I had a very loving home. It's not necessarily, and I like to point this out, it's not necessarily my parents' fault if I didn't perceive I have a loving home, because remember what you said earlier, we create our own reality.
yeah.
And so you can give a child a lot and they cannot take that on board the way that you intend it to be taken, or you cannot understand enough about what your parents are going through to make allowances for them that you might make when you're 40 looking back, you know? So this is not, and I really do have to emphasize, this is not a judgment of how my parents parented, because I honestly believe my parents loved me and they definitely did their best. So this is not a judgment. But the 5 things that they showed me involved drug abuse, involved alcoholism, involved sexual abuse. And I'm like, well, I don't know that I'm up for that, to be honest. Thank you very much. And then they showed me my brother and I went, I'll go, I'll do this life. I'll do this life. I'll go back and I'll do it. And then bang, I'm back in my body. There was not, by the time I actually agreed to go and being back in my body was like being hit with an axe on the back of the head. All the pain returned. I felt the slam as I went back into my body, very much as when somebody gets an electric shock. You know, if you've got the cardiac paddles on and boom, that's pretty much how it feels. And I was immediately back in the pain and bawling my eyes out. Now, I just spent 10 days, lost half my body weight, boiling to death on a bed. Both of my arms and both of my feet are tied to planks of wood, actual planks of wood, to hold them down on the bed, to keep them straight, because I had drips everywhere. And I have managed in this out-of-body experience to sit bolt upright in bed and hold my hands out before me, straight out before me. And I come back and I am screaming, I promise I'll do it. I promise, I promise, I promise. I collapse onto the pillows because obviously now I'm back in real life. I can't sustain holding myself up any longer. I don't actually have the muscle to do it. So it must have been an adrenaline rush that got me there. And I'm screaming. And that's when I'm reliving everything and what I've promised and what I've been shown and what I'm going to have to live through that I've promised I'll live through, including the bad stuff. And an absolute cow of a nurse comes in, tells me off, yells at me, and punches the hell out of my leg. And I'm so horrified, I go into shock and I forget what I promised. And the rest of the book talks about me searching for that promise.
I read that and I was horrified just reading it. How a nurse could do that, you know, but that kind of stuff does happen, unfortunately. So
sadly, and I can vouch for it. And a year later, when I told my mother what had happened, she said, I always wondered what that was on your leg. Nobody knew how it could have formed. Even the doctor asked what had happened. But it took me a year to be able to talk about it. It shocked me so much.
Yeah, I was just going to say that after all the trauma you've already been through, because, you know, my first thought is, well, why doesn't she say something, you know? But then thinking about it, it's like, well, gee, think about everything she's already been through. It's like, you know, but yeah.
While it distressed me enormously and the unfairness of it was to gradually boil and simmer in my system enough for me to talk about it, and that's what allowed me to talk about it eventually. At that time, I was too happy to be alive. I was too happy to have survived. I had this post NDE, the world is the most beautiful place. How could we not realize how beautiful the world is, you know? So really, whatever had happened was in the past.
You know, I've listened to and read about hundreds of NDEs, and coming back, your feeling is somewhat unique, because some people don't want to come back and they do come back and they don't want to be here and they're depressed and for sometimes for a year or two because they're back, whereas you came back and you had this zeal for life that you didn't seem to have before, at least from what I've read.
Yeah, I had the opposite effect.
So, well, that was what sounds like that's what you needed to go on with your life, because before that you didn't really want to be here, it seemed like.
Well, I didn't see any point to it. You know, I had a narcissistic mother. I was the typical girl victim, the second child, the typical, we'll pick on that one. I didn't know that's what was the problem. I just knew that I was never good enough. My brother made sure I knew I wasn't ever good enough. He was not a loving, kind brother. Both my mother and my brother were very, very wonderful with other people. So she helped train him to be the target. So, you know, there were psychological issues within the family. Another story entirely, really, that I chose not to put the deepness of that thread in the book, because I completely understand how it happened. And I've long forgiven both of them, because she was a young mum left on her own while my dad was at sea with this baby brother of mine. He's a year older than me, and he barely slept. He had an advanced brain, an extremely bright man. By the time he was 1, he had the brain of about a 4-year-old. So he used to scream a lot, didn't know what to do with himself. He was fully reading and doing all these things that babies shouldn't do. These days, he would have been given the help, and she would have been given the help that she needed for that sort of advanced brain. But she was all on her own, and she lived in what you call, I think, a mobile home. We call them a caravan, which is all my parents could afford. They were, mum worked in a bank. She wasn't allowed to work in a bank in those days once she fell pregnant, so she lost her job. So that left Dad to provide an income before they'd actually saved up enough to buy a home, and that was all they could afford. So that's what they did, and they did incredibly well with their lives. So, and at one point, my mum actually became my hero. So, there's a whole
that's
other.
good. Do you have a bit? Is your mom still alive, or?
No, I lost them in 2021. Both of them 6 weeks apart.
Oh boy.
Poor thing. Yeah.
Did you end up with a better relationship with your mom later in life, or?
I worked hard on building a decent relationship. I was always there for my mother, but you find that if you have a narcissistic parent, the victim will always be there anyway. But I think regardless, I would have been there. That's my nature. To me, it didn't matter what I thought of them. I always saw them as having worked very, very hard and done their absolute best. They came to Australia to give us a better life, because they knew they couldn't provide what we would need, and especially what my brother would need. But it turned out I was almost as bright as him, but I developed at a more normal rate. Thank goodness. Couldn't provide in the UK, so they moved us over here and built a wonderful life for us.
Oh, that's good. Did you come back with any gifts that you didn't have before? It sounds like you were born with certain gifts. Did you come back with any gifts that you didn't have before your near-death experience?
I can't honestly say, because they weren't initially obvious, and I didn't know what my capacity were or how many gifts I actually had. I do remember when I was about 8, my spirit visitors came and packed a lot of my gifts, very indignant I was, into a box, some sort of treasure box, told me I would be given them back later in life, and took them away. And for the life of me, I can't tell you what they were, except that I do know I can no longer move objects. So I assume that was one of them, because after that time, it never worked. So they were the things that would have had me singled out in society, because there's no way as a teenager I wouldn't be putting that on public display with my friends, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I honestly, I can't say. I do know that I have discovered things that I did not ever expect to discover, and I went on to push myself to learn more and see how far I could take my mind. And as you will read in the second half of the book, and I hope I haven't put too much detail in it because it was a horrendous affair, but I lived through, in my mind one night, a whole massacre from every individual's perspective that was in it. And so when I wrote the story of that, I was very careful to right enough to give an idea of what my gifts were like without scaring the hell and letting people live through the actual gruesomeness of the event. Because there are many people in Australia living today who lived through it.
Mm.
And I wasn't there. What I've learned is that when I have premonitive dreams like that, there is always some kind of link. So if I'm not there, I will second-handedly know someone who is there. And in this case, one of the ladies who was shot, that I was in the car, I was her sitting in the car when she was shot through the window. I didn't know who she was. She was nobody to me. I was just devastated by what I was seeing and living through. She turned out to be a workmate and a very good friend of the lady who 2 years later became my sister-in-law.
Oh, wow.
So
So this was a premonition dream that came true then?
Yes.
Okay.
One of the hardest things that I have lived with in my life is premonitions of disasters and deaths.
Hmm.
And not so many personal deaths. So if it's not a personal death, I have to be honest, if it's a film star, it's more likely to upset someone else because I've managed to maintain emotional distance. Like you learn to protect yourself and control certain things in your life being an empath. And I have learned to keep that barrier. So I will do things like really upset my children one day by walking through the lounge room. Heath Ledger's on TV, and I said, I don't know who that guy is, but he's going to die young.
Mm.
Both
Yeah.
my girls are devastated. They're teenagers, so Heath Ledger was a hard. Yeah, so they're devastated. Stop because they're upset, and I look at it, and then the wave of empathy hits me, and I'm upset for this young man. So that sort of thing I can deal with. It's really big stuff like 9/11, which I didn't put in the book because I don't think it's my story to tell. But I touched on that in my life by starting just after I had children. I started to dream of a large school. I would be standing on the veranda of a school. Then I would be inside a classroom, and always over the hills there was smoke coming up over the hills. So I knew this premonition meant something a long way away from me was going to be a disaster. I didn't know what it was. Then I started seeing planes before I would see the smoke. So I became afraid that there was going to be a war in my children's lifetime. They were little at the time. So this was quite a few years before September 11. And then the closer it got, the nastier the dreams got. So eventually I knew that there were multi-story buildings involved, but I didn't know where they were. I knew they were a city. I knew they were a long, long way away. One point I got to, which was 2 weeks before it happened, and that was the last time I dreamt of it, was that I was so scared I refused to leave the veranda with my children, and they were locking the school up, and I refused to leave until my husband came to get me to keep us safe. And even now I'm like getting choked up because I knew there was going to be a disaster. It involved tall buildings and a plane, but I didn't know where it was. And let's be honest, I couldn't have stopped it if I had.
Yeah.
But yeah, Port Arthur was another thing altogether because I went from person to person to person to person to person, and people were being killed. And so I was being killed, and I was seeing and feeling the last seconds. And I'd never had anything like that before, but that's when I decided it was time to stop. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm shutting down.
Well, Lynne, I could talk to you for hours and listen to your lifetime stories, but I think it's time to bring it to a close. And I think you've given enough on your book that people. I'm excited to go finish reading it now and to get more details. But before we go, I wanted to ask you: is there any messages that you wanted to give people, to leave people with? In particular right now?
Yeah, the whole point of writing my book is that I've taken what we call psychic abilities to the extreme. I pushed my mind without any education, so I was self-educated. I pushed my mind to the extreme. And while I don't recommend anybody do that, I suggest that everybody starts paying more attention to their own intuition and their own fleeting thoughts, and spend some time in silence every day, or ask themselves before they go to sleep at night, what do I need to know most? Because it's all processed, I believe, through your subconscious mind, which has no filters. So if you're going to receive your messages, you will receive them at night. You will wake up in the morning just knowing them. You might have to ask for a week until you develop a strong enough neurological pathway for the messages to start coming through. But I think everybody needs to develop this. I think it's a basic human skill meant to keep us safe, meant to be used to maneuver through daily life and to save us a lot of angst when used properly. So yeah, that's my biggest lesson, I think.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's an important message that people, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this too. And are you open to people contacting you, and do you have some way for them to contact you if you are?
Yeah, they can contact me through my Facebook author page. So it's Lynne McGee author on Facebook.
Oh, okay, great.
They're quite to get in contact with me that way.
Fantastic. Well, Lynne, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and having you on. And we'll have to do this again sometime and go down some other rabbit holes about your life. and thank you for writing your book and doing what you're doing. I think it's important for humanity to wake up to what's going on and to help us move into a better society, or a new earth, if you will. And so I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you doing your part in that.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you very much. It's been so lovely chatting with you. It's been really good. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts, actually. I'll be following.
Well, thank you.